The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. That very same day, two of them were on their way to a village called Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking together about all that had happened. Now, as they talked this over, Jesus himself came up and walked by their side, but something prevented them from recognizing him. He said to them, "What matters are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped short, their faces downcast. Then one of them, called Cleopas, answered him, "You must be the only person staying in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have been happening there these last few days." "What things?" he asked. "All about Jesus of Nazareth," they answered, "who proved he was a great prophet by the things he said and did in the sight of God and of the whole people, and how our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death and had him crucified. Our own hope had been that he would be the one to set Israel free. And this is not all. 2 whole days have gone by since it all happened, and some women from our group have astounded us. They went to the tomb in the early morning, and when they did not find the body, they came back to tell us they had seen a vision of angels who declared he was alive. Some of our friends went to the tomb and found everything exactly as the women had reported, but of him they saw nothing." Then he said to them, "You foolish men, so slow to believe the full message of the prophets. Was it not ordained that the Christ should suffer and so enter into his glory?" Then, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets, he explained to them the passages throughout the scriptures that were about himself. When they drew near to the village to which they were going, he made as if to go on, but they pressed him to stay with them. "It is nearly evening," they said, "and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. Now while he was with them at the table, he took the bread and said the blessing. Then he broke it and handed it to them. And their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he had vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us when he talked and explained the scriptures to us?" They set out that instant and returned to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 assembled together with their companions, who said to them, "Yes, it is true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then they told their story of what had happened on the road and how they had recognized him at the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. My apologies, some of you I noticed were using your missals. I've chosen the third option for the gospel today, which is not there on that page, but it's on a little 475, I think, a little bit later. So my apologies. The only reason I chose this third gospel is it's my favorite, so hopefully I can make it your favorite too along the way. You know, this passage, as I said, is something that seems so ordinary and only occurs in Luke's gospel. It doesn't occur in any of the other gospels. So Mark has it at the end, but that's most probably an addition by some little editor a little bit later. But Mark has just one line about 2 disciples having seen Jesus. Like I said at the beginning, you know, this entire little word that goes in terms of saying that, you know what, quite often we think of the end of the world, the master thinks as something else. That quite often what the caterpillar thinks as the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. And that is so beautifully brought out in this reading. Let me at least, show you 3 ways in which I think this reading brings out this overturning of our disappointment, of our despair, of our lack of hope, and how this reading, in one sense, overturns that entire feeling or that entire understanding of despair. The first thing I think that the reading does is it tells us that quite often along the journey of life, you are going to be hit hard. There is no way out of that. That whatever you do in life, there is no way, some event of pain, some despair, some amount of desertion, somebody will betray you, you will fall terribly ill, you will lose your finances, something or the other will happen. It is inevitable in our lives. There is no way out of this. And the Gospels center this up front, especially through the crucifixion. And you see this in these disciples who go out from Jerusalem in despair. They think that they have actually thought that they were going to become ministers and chieftains and God knows what else. And here is this man they followed, killed horribly on a cross, just like any common criminal. I think if any of us were in their place, we would have had the same feeling. I just go back to an example of mine when I went through my own little sorrows. I had lost my mother to a horrible illness of cancer. I was the only one that time at home, so I stayed with her 1 month in the hospital, seeing her life slowly, painfully ebbing away. And the way some days she would scream in pain and things like that. So it was as much an agony of death for her as it was for me, who was sitting next to her bed the whole time. And by the end of the month when she died, I was grateful. And even more, I thought that now was the time that the Lord would leave me in peace and let me go and grieve somewhere in peace. And to my horror, I got news just a little while after she died that her cousin, about the same age, also had exactly the same cancer and was being brought to Bombay. And even worse, the daughter rang me up and said, "Can you come over and be with us when we arrive?" And I thought to myself, not once again. I don't want to go through all this again. And my first instinct would have been to tell her, please get lost, you handle your pain yourself. But anyway, I went to the hospital, and my first look at this person, a loved cousin, was that in spite of what his wife was jabbering away to me, she was a charismatic, and she was, in the charismatic group, and she said all her groups at home were in Goa. I come from Goa also. So all her groups in Goa were praying for him and that this person would live. And one look at him and I realized that at least after seeing what had happened to my mother, it was exactly the same cancer, must be running in the family somewhere. But anyway, I knew that he was going to die. So I met them, I talked with them, I consoled them as best as I could. And as I was leaving, I called the daughter out because I said, the wife is not going to take this very well. So I called the daughter out and said, I've just been through all this, and you will just have to prepare yourself for your father's death. And even worse, console your mother and be at her side as she goes through this agony, because it'll take you some time, but he's not going to live. And strangely, she believed me, and she kept talking with me throughout this 2-3 weeks that they were in Mumbai. I would come often to their place and celebrate Mass in the little hospital room that they were in. And on the whole, I found that by the end of it, both they and me had actually been consoled through the celebrating of this Eucharist 2 or 3 days while he was there. And even worse, to increase this story, there was another group of charismatics that entered the room one day, and they told the family that, there is something in your house that has caused all this. Evil exists in your doorway, and if you get rid of it, then everything will be all right. And after these 2 people, the family talked over it, and they were talking with me. The only thing they could figure out is at the entrance of their house, they had this lovely, in these old Portuguese houses, if you see, they had these hat stands. I don't know if some of you come from, there was a Souza here from Portugal. Anyway, so they have these lovely hat stands, and it was actually in the shape of a serpent with, crawled up, exactly like, the book of Numbers 12, where Moses, puts up a, serpent for them to worship. So it was that at the entrance. And the wife was convinced that that was the evil thing, and she said, we must write home and tell our family to burn it up. And the man said, no, 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 this has been in our family for years, and it's actually a sign of goodness. It's exactly the sign that Moses put up, where people looked up to it and said, and they were not bitten by the snake. They asked me my opinion, and I said, see, all these things are superstitions. If the Lord wants you to live, you will live. If the Lord wants you to die, you will die. And between this, there is no serpent and stick and hat stand that is going to come in the way. So anyway, he was a man of deep faith. And he told his wife, just leave it there. It has been there many generations. And if I have to go, I go. And about 2 weeks later, the hospital doctors gave up. They sent him back to Goa. And interestingly, just 1 hour before he died, he told his daughter to ring me up, and he spoke to me. And he said, all that you have spoken about has come true, and I'm ready to meet my Maker. It was a horrible experience, but I'm ready to meet him. And he died very peacefully, and his family was very consoled by the way he took it. And I think exactly like this reading, here was I on my way, thinking that I had finished my way of the cross, exactly like Jesus going and finishing his way of the cross. And the Lord says, no, your way of the cross is not over, actually. You are to accompany another family on their own way of the cross and make it easier for them. And so I think, many times in our lives, this is going to happen to us. Exactly like this walk of Emmaus, when you fall ill, when something bad happens to you, when you lose a job, when you lose a loved one, when you are jilted by your lover, somebody is always there to accompany you. If you have faith, that angel will appear in a form that is human or animal or whatever. Somebody will accompany you in your pain. And that's the first message of this gospel. We are never, ever left alone by God, except that sometimes we don't recognize this person as an angel or somebody sent by God. It could even be a dog that sometimes, accompanies us and is with us along the way. So it could be anything, but God sends somebody to us to help us during our time of struggle. The second thing I think that this gospel reading points out to us is that sometimes pain is something we learn from. Sometimes pain gives us a new mission. Sometimes pain opens our eyes to other realities that we were not aware of. I'm sure some of you are from Irish backgrounds here, but my school, where I studied in Mount Abu, had the Irish Christian Brothers, and we were bombarded by the story of St. Patrick. And if you look at the story of St. Patrick, it's an interesting story, because here is a person in his young days, perhaps somewhere in Scotland or England, we don't know where, but around that border area, was captured by Irish pirates, taken to Ireland, and made into a slave and a farmer and a shepherd there. Somehow, he says he heard the voice of God, and he managed to escape one day, came down to a ship. The ship, after great argument, allowed him on board, and he reached back home. But he never forgot this entire experience of being in Ireland. By the way, that time, Ireland was entirely what, quote unquote, would have been called pagan in those days. It was not yet Christian. And he thought that if these people treated me so horribly, surely they need the message of love. Surely they need the message of Christ. And he goes on to France, studies theology, is ordained, and the Pope Celestine sends him back to Ireland. Imagine, I don't know what you would think. If you have been caught, tortured in some place, you're not going back there in a hurry. But here is this man who thinks because of this that he needs to go back to this place. And he becomes the apostle of Ireland. He is the one who in many ways initiated Catholicism into Ireland. Of course, the unfortunate part is an aside. Perhaps we'll need a new St. Patrick today to go to Ireland because it is not much Catholic anymore. But that's another matter. But the point is that here is a person who was tortured, who was treated as a slave, and wants to go back there. It's exactly like the disciples. Here they are running away from Jerusalem because of this horrible experience. And by the end of the reading, they're running back to Jerusalem to proclaim the good news. The Lord is risen. We have met him along the way. He is truly alive. A totally different group of people who start off at the reading and who end the reading. Totally different attitudes, totally different atmosphere. And that's what sometimes could happen to us if we are open enough to the Lord. A torturous experience, a horrible experience could be turned around and made into something that becomes prophetic, that we can proclaim as good news. And I'm sure there are many of you here that have had such experiences. Of course, it's easy enough to talk about pain and death. And I think also the reading points to a third aspect, that quite often there is no answer to why pain, to why death, to why these horrible things happen to us. If you notice in the reading, nowhere is it clearly said, why did Jesus actually have to die such a horrible death to save us? There could have been another less horrible way. It's not actually clearly mentioned why. It just says that the Lord explained to them why he must die and why he must rise again. But there is no clear understanding anywhere in this reading that tells us as a very kind of convincing way that this was the only way for Jesus. And quite often in our pain and sorrow, you will realize you really have no answer why this should happen to you. Just like Job, at the end of the day, it's a mystery that remains with us. I've seen this happening to so many. In my own parish where I come from in Bombay, there was this middle-aged woman, for instance, who was the life of the party and life of the church. She would be the one conducting, like you, the choir. She would be the one, helping people in distress. She would be the one, for instance, she designed for us a beautiful book with illustrations on the spiritual exercises. She got cancer and had a horrible time. And the whole parish asked the question, what is it in this person's life that she deserves to die this way? And she herself just says, I have surrendered myself to the Lord because even I don't understand why I must go through this. Or even more, another interesting example, April 2nd, we celebrate the Jubilee of John Paul II's death. And if you remember John Paul II, he died in a very interesting way. He died in the full glare of the public. It was practically a public spectacle. John Paul II, every day as he was dying, he would be put onto a wheelchair. He would come out onto his window, and the Pieta below would be filled with people praying for him. None of them were actually praying for a miracle. None of them were expecting him to survive. All that they were doing was accompanying him on his death. And he himself never asked them to pray for a miracle that he would survive. He died in the full public glare. Just like Jesus, sometimes there is no answer to why death or why pain or why sorrow. It is only a total surrender to the Lord's will that exists. And that's what John Paul II did as he died in the public as a public spectacle, really, with a full TV, on full TV. It was, in one sense, a very strange way of dying, but I think what he proclaimed was that death is not the end. Even though I'm suffering horribly and I don't know why, God is with me, and you people are with me in your prayer, accompanying me in this painful journey. And I think, those three things are the most important in this reading that we have had today. But I think there's just one more that I'd like to worry you about. If you look at this reading carefully, I don't know how many of you have ever noticed. Just look at the way it is structured. It's exactly like the Eucharist we celebrate. There is a journey. Each of you come from somewhere into this chapel. Okay? Each of you come with your own worries, with your own anxieties, with your own sorrows, with your own joy. Each of you enter this chapel that way. And then the word is proclaimed. Exactly here, Jesus meets them along the way and proclaims the word. He reads out passages from Scripture that explains what he calls his death and resurrection and what it means. So we have exactly that first part. If you look a little more carefully, the next part of the reading is exactly what we do here. We consecrate the Eucharist. And the words that he uses are exactly the same as we use today. Just look at what he says, for instance. Now, while he was with them at the table, he took the bread, said the blessing, broke it, and handed it to them. That's exactly our formula that we use when we consecrate the Eucharist. And then at the end of it, Jesus disappears and they go back proclaiming the good news. So if you see what Luke has done very cleverly, like a good, storyteller, a good story actually has a hidden meaning behind it that we don't often notice right up front. It's a story, but there's always something at the back of it that reveals something much more deep. And that's what this little passage does. It tells us Jesus may have died, but the Eucharist actually continues to celebrate his death and resurrection every day in our lives as we celebrate it. And that if we are careful enough to partake of this Eucharist, we will have the same experience of the resurrection. And that's why the early Christians actually did not celebrate the Eucharist on the Sabbath, on Sunday. They celebrate it on the day of the resurrection, which is Sunday. They changed the date to the next. So every Eucharist is actually a celebration of the resurrection of the Lord. So maybe just go home if you have time and just look at the passage. It's actually a hidden Eucharist. It's actually exactly like the way we celebrate the Eucharist, and it's telling us very clearly, if you are afraid, if you have pain, if somebody has ditched you, if you have a calamity in your lives, go back to the Eucharist, and there you will encounter the risen Lord. The risen Lord who accompanies you in your journey of pain. The risen Lord who will change your pain into something meaningful. The risen Lord who, even if you don't understand that pain, it's all right. All he asks of you, like me on the cross, surrender yourself to the Lord and say, it is accomplished. That's what each one of us needs to do at the end of the day. And so the Eucharist really then becomes, every Eucharist becomes a celebration of the Lord's resurrection. It's a celebration of the Lord breaking himself for us, accompanying us on the journey of our life, and enabling us to see that our deaths, our lives are meaningful, much beyond the horizon of our pain and of the life that we live at this point of time. And so really I end again with the same phrase. For the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly